The Shawville Farmhouse Disturbance. The Ottawa Valley sits along the boundary line that separates Quebec from Ontario, a region defined by its rugged terrain, dense woodlands, and a history of hardscrabble agriculture that demanded resilience from the families who settled there in the 19th century. In the late autumn of 1889, the landscape was already turning gray and brittle with the approach of winter, and the farming community of Shawville was settling into the seasonal rhythm of harvest and preparation for the deep cold. It was a place where reputation meant everything, and where the practical demands of survival left little room for superstition or flights of fancy. The people who lived there were Methodists and Presbyterians, grounded in a strict work ethic and a literal interpretation of the world around them. This context is vital to understanding the events that centered on the farmhouse of George Dagg, a 30-year-old farmer who was, by all accounts, a typical, hard-working member of the community. He lived in a modest wood frame house approximately 7 miles from the village of Shawville with his wife Susan, their 2 young children, and an 11-year-old Scottish orphan named Dinah Burden McLean, whom the family had taken in to help with chores. There was nothing remarkable about the Dagg farm, nothing in its history or its construction that suggested it would become the focal point of one of the most rigorously documented unexplained episodes in Canadian history. The disturbance did not begin with a storm or a dramatic omen, but with the mundane details of daily life shifting slightly out of alignment. It started on a Sunday morning in mid-September, a time when the light was clear and the house was quiet. The family noticed that a distinct, pungent smell of manure had permeated the kitchen, seemingly without a source. Upon inspection, they found smears of wet filth appearing on the floorboards, fresh and glistening, in rooms where no one had walked with muddy boots. George Dagg initially assumed this was a prank or a result of carelessness by the children, perhaps even Dinah, though the girl denied it. He cleaned the floors only to find the filth reappearing minutes later in a different pattern. It was an annoyance, a hygiene issue that frustrated Susan Dagg, but it was not yet frightening. It was merely a domestic puzzle. This low-level harassment continued for days, escalating slowly from smears of mud to the displacement of small objects. A jug of milk left on a secure table would be found overturned or moved to the floor. A butter crock was found with its contents smeared, the lid hidden in a different room. The family tried to rationalize these events as the actions of a mischievous child, and suspicion naturally fell on Dinah, the outsider in the family dynamic. She was a quiet girl, often described as timid, and she became the focus of George's early frustration. He disciplined her, believing that the chaos was her doing, a cry for attention or an act of rebellion. But the activity did not stop when Dinah was under observation, and it soon moved beyond the capacity of a young girl's sleight of hand. The situation shifted from domestic annoyance to genuine danger on the afternoon of September 15th. The family was gathered in the main living area when they saw a large jar of pickles, which had been sitting securely on a shelf, lift itself into the air. It did not fall, it was launched. The heavy glass jar flew across the room with significant force, shattering against the opposite wall. As the family stood in the debris, stunned by the impossibility of what they had just seen, a second object, a flat iron used for pressing clothes, was hurled from its resting place. It struck the floor with a heavy thud, missing the children by inches. This was the moment the atmosphere in the house changed from frustration to fear. George Dagg, a man accustomed to dealing with the tangible problems of farming, broken fences, sick livestock, bad weather, found himself confronting a force that had no physical form but possessed physical strength. He searched the house, looking for wires, for hidden strings, for any mechanism that could explain the movement. He found nothing. The house was structurally sound. There were no intruders. The windows were shut, the doors were bolted, and yet the interior of the home had become a firing range. The phenomenon escalated rapidly over the next 48 hours, introducing a new and far more terrifying element: fire. It began with small, inexplicable combustions. A window curtain in the parlor suddenly burst into flames. There was no fireplace nearby, no candle, no match. The fire seemed to ignite from within the fabric itself. Susan Dagg rushed to extinguish it, beating the flames out with a rug. Before the smoke had even cleared from the parlor, a second fire started in the bedroom upstairs. Then a third in the kitchen. The family spent the entire day running from room to room, battling spontaneous ignitions that targeted flammable materials, paper, cloth, bedding. The fires were not large initially, but the frequency was overwhelming. In a single day, 8 separate fires broke out within the house. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was immense. The family could not sleep. They could not eat. They were trapped in a cycle of panic, waiting for the smell of smoke that would signal the next attack. It became clear that the house was no longer safe, and George Dagg made the decision to move his wife and children to a neighbor's home for their safety, leaving him to guard the property. But the activity did not cease with the family's departure. It seemed to anchor itself to the location and, specifically, to the presence of the young girl, Dinah. Word of the disturbances at the Dagg farm spread quickly through the tight-knit community of Shawville. In a rural settlement, secrets were hard to keep, and the sight of the Dagg family fleeing their home drew attention. Initially, the neighbors were skeptical. The idea of spirits or poltergeists was not something that sensible farmers entertained. It was viewed as superstition, or worse, a hoax concocted to cover up domestic troubles. However, as the stories grew more intense, curiosity drove the neighbors to investigate for themselves. They did not come to gawk, they came to debunk. Men like Arthur Smart, William Dagg, and Charles Bowie, respected figures in the region, arrived at the farm with the intention of exposing the trickery. They were practical men who knew how the world worked. They set up watches, sitting in the kitchen for hours, observing every corner of the room, watching Dinah closely to ensure she was not moving her hands or throwing objects. They expected to catch a child in a lie. Instead, they became witnesses to the impossible. One of the most documented incidents during this period involved a large stone that smashed through the kitchen window while a group of men was present. The men immediately ran outside, expecting to find a prankster hiding in the bushes or behind the barn. The yard was empty, the fields were clear, there was nowhere for a person to hide. They returned inside, unsettled but still looking for a rational explanation. As they stood discussing the event, another stone struck the house. This time, they noticed something peculiar about the trajectory. The stones did not seem to be coming from the outside in the traditional sense. Witnesses reported that some stones seemed to materialize in mid-air or pass through the glass without shattering it, only to fall heavily onto the floorboards. Other times, the glass would shatter, but the stone would land gently, rolling to a stop as if it had no momentum. The physics of the interactions were wrong. The force required to break the window should have sent the stone flying across the room, yet it simply dropped. The men, who were familiar with the mechanics of throwing and impact, could not reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew to be true. The skepticism of the community evaporated as more people experienced the phenomena firsthand. It wasn't just one or two impressionable individuals, it was a collective experience. A document was eventually drawn up, a formal affidavit signed by 17 witnesses attesting to the reality of the events. These were not anonymous sources. They were the heads of local families, people with reputations to protect. They swore that they had seen fires ignite without cause, stones thrown by invisible hands, and furniture moving of its own accord. This document remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the case, a testament to the fact that whatever was happening at the Dag farm was an objective reality, not a subjective hallucination. The sheer number of witnesses made it impossible to dismiss the events as mass hysteria. They stood in the room, they felt the heat of the fires, they dodged the flying objects, they heard the sounds. As the physical manifestations continued, the nature of the haunting evolved. It shifted from telekinetic violence to something more intelligent and communicative. A sound began to permeate the house, a low, guttural noise that initially resembled the growling of a dog or the grinding of heavy stones. Over time, this sound refined itself, sharpening into a voice. It was not a human voice, or at least it did not sound like any human the family knew. It was described as gruff, masculine, and varying in pitch. It seemed to come from empty space, sometimes from the ceiling, sometimes from the center of the room, and occasionally it seemed to emanate from the vicinity of Dinah. The witnesses repeatedly checked her mouth and throat and found them motionless. The voice was crude and often obscene, shouting profanities that shocked the conservative religious sensibilities of the onlookers. It mocked the farmers, calling them by name, revealing personal secrets that a stranger could not have known, and engaging in arguments with those brave enough to speak back. The arrival of Percy Woodcock, a well-known artist and amateur psychical researcher from Brockville, marked a turning point in the documentation of the case. Woodcock had heard reports of the Dag mystery and traveled to Shawville with a skeptical but open mind. He was a man of education and culture, distinct from the rough-hewn farming community, and his presence added a layer of analytical observation to the chaos. Woodcock did not just watch, he engaged. He spent days at the farm, recording the events with a meticulous eye for detail. He witnessed the movement of objects, the sudden fires, and, most disturbingly, he conversed with the voice. Woodcock's accounts describe a presence that was mercurial, sometimes angry and violent, other times strangely docile and even theological. He noted that the entity seemed to have a split personality. At times, it claimed to be a devil, reveling in the chaos it caused. At other times, it sang hymns with a terrifyingly beautiful clarity, its voice changing timbre to sound almost angelic. One particular afternoon, Woodcock conducted an experiment to test the intelligence and perception of the entity. He took a pencil and wrote a question on a piece of paper, hiding it from view so that no one in the room, especially Dinah, could see it. He then asked the voice to answer the question. The voice, emanating from the empty air near the ceiling, correctly answered the written query. Woodcock repeated the test with different questions, shielding his actions, and each time the voice responded accurately. This suggested to Woodcock that the entity possessed a form of clairvoyance or telepathy, able to perceive things that were not physically visible. It was not merely reacting to the environment, it was observing it on a level that bypassed normal sensory channels. This intelligence made the threat feel significantly more acute. It wasn't just a blind force of nature, it was a conscious observer that was watching them, listening to them, and reacting to their thoughts. The focus on Dinah Burden McLean became increasingly intense during this phase. The entity often claimed that it was there for her, sometimes threatening to take her away, other times claiming it belonged to her. The psychological pressure on the 11-year-old girl was devastating. She was the center of a storm she could not understand, blamed by some for the events, feared by others, and terrified by the voice that seemed to hover over her shoulder. Yet, despite the suspicion that she was somehow the source, the physical evidence often exonerated her. On one occasion, A heavy harmonic organ was lifted and tipped over, while Dinah was visibly standing on the other side of the room, surrounded by witnesses who were holding her hands to ensure she did not move. The sheer weight of the organ required two grown men to lift it back upright. An 11-year-old girl, even if she had been free to move, could not have generated the force necessary to tip it. The phenomenon was using her as a focal point, but it was operating with a power that exceeded her physical capabilities. The interactions between the entity and the family reached a bizarre peak when the voice began to demand specific actions. It would order George Dagg to perform tasks, or it would demand food. In one disturbing instance, a piece of buttered bread was placed on a table as a sort of offering or test. Witnesses watched as the bread was lifted into the air by an invisible hand. Bites appeared in the bread, disappearing into nothingness, accompanied by the sound of chewing and swallowing. The bread was consumed in front of their eyes, leaving only crumbs. This biological mimicry, the sound of breathing, the sound of eating, the capacity to speak, blurred the line between a spectral haunting and a physical presence. It was as if the entity was trying to build a body for itself out of the available energy in the house. It was becoming more solid, more undeniable with every passing day. The climax of the haunting occurred in mid-November, roughly 3 months after it began. The intensity of the disturbances had reached an unsustainable level. The fires were constant, the noise was deafening, and the crowds of onlookers were disrupting the entire operation of the farm. The entity, which had engaged in long theological debates with Woodcock and the family, began to show signs of changing its demeanor. After weeks of profanity and violence, the voice shifted toward a more somber, almost repentant tone. It began to speak of departure. It claimed that its time was ending. The shift was as baffling as the arrival. There was no exorcism performed, no ritual cleansing that drove it away. The dynamic simply exhausted itself. The voice announced that it would leave on a specific date, promising peace to the family that it had tormented. On the final day, the atmosphere in the house was heavy with anticipation. The family and the assembled witnesses waited, unsure if this was another trick. The voice spoke for the last time, offering a final farewell that was strangely devoid of the malice that had characterized its earlier interactions. It sounded weary. Then the sounds ceased. The house, which had been a cacophony of banging, crashing, and shouting for months, fell into a profound silence. The heavy, oppressive feeling that had hung over the property lifted. George Dagg checked the rooms. The fires had stopped. The objects sat still on their shelves. The air smelled only of the wood stove and the cold autumn wind outside. The presence was gone. The aftermath of the Dagg haunting left the community of Shawville with more questions than answers. The signed statement by the 17 witnesses was published in the local newspapers, the Times, Pontiac Advance-Times, and others, serving as a public record of the impossible. These men put their names to a document that could have ruined their reputations, swearing that they had seen the laws of physics violated. They described the events not as a ghost story, but as a series of facts. The fires happened, the stones were thrown, the voice spoke. There was no attempt to embellish, only to record. Percy Woodcock left the farm with his notes, deeply affected by what he had seen. He had arrived a skeptic and left convinced that he had interacted with an intelligence that defied scientific explanation. George Dagg and his family remained on the farm. They did not flee the region, nor did they capitalize on the fame of the event. They simply went back to work. The crops needed to be harvested, the animals needed to be tended, and the winter was coming on hard. They repaired the broken windows, scrubbed the soot from the walls, and replaced the shattered crockery. Dinah Burden McLean grew up, eventually marrying and moving away, leaving the shadow of the haunting behind her. But the story remained, etched into the local history of the Ottawa Valley. It was not a legend whispered around campfires. It was a matter of public record, supported by affidavits and newspaper reports. What makes the DAG case distinct is the lack of resolution regarding the nature of the entity. It did not fit the traditional mold of a ghost of a deceased person returning to right a wrong. It had no clear identity. It was elemental, chaotic, and trickster-like. It played with the family, terrorized them, debated them, and then simply lost interest. It was a raw intrusion of the unexplained into the mundane reality of rural Canadian life. The image of the hardy farmers, men of the soil and the Bible, standing in a circle in a drafty farmhouse, watching a jar of pickles fly through the air and listening to a disembodied voice sing hymns, remains one of the most striking and surreal tableaus in the annals of North American paranormal history. The silence that followed the departure of the entity was absolute. There were no recurring anniversaries, no residual hauntings. The farm became just a farm again. But for those who were there, for the 17 men who signed the paper and the family that lived through the fire and the noise, the world had fundamentally changed. They had seen the curtain pulled back, revealing a chaotic, noisy, and intelligent darkness waiting just behind the veneer of the everyday world. The Dag Farm disturbance stands as a testament to the reality of the inexplicable, a moment when the impossible forced itself into the lives of ordinary people and demanded to be acknowledged before vanishing back into the gray mists of the Ottawa Valley. The sound of the gray forest. The interior of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state is defined by its density and a specific type of silence that carries a heavy weight. In the early 1990s, a small group of experienced forestry surveyors and environmental researchers began documenting a series of sensory anomalies in a remote drainage basin located several miles from any maintained trailheads. The area was characterized by old-growth cedar and hemlock trees that blocked out a significant portion of the daylight, creating a permanent twilight on the forest floor even during the height of summer. These professionals were accustomed to the isolation of the Pacific Northwest wilderness, but the reports coming out of this specific sector began to deviate from the standard challenges of fieldwork. It started with the persistent feeling of being watched from the tree line, a common psychological reaction to deep woods environments, but it quickly evolved into something more structurally organized and difficult to dismiss as mere isolation-induced anxiety. One surveyor, who had spent over a decade mapping remote sections of the Cascades and the Olympics, noted in his logs that the wildlife in the drainage basin seemed to disappear entirely once the sun dipped below the surrounding ridges. Usually, a forest of that size and health would be loud with the sounds of nocturnal insects, owls, and small mammals. Instead, the team described a vacuum of sound that felt unnatural. When they spoke to one another, their voices did not seem to carry. The sound would drop off just a few feet away from the speaker, as if the air itself was too thick to transmit vibrations. This acoustic dead zone became the primary focus of their private discussions at camp, as it interfered with their ability to coordinate their movements across the rugged terrain. They began to refer to the phenomenon as the gray blanket, describing how the fog and the silence seemed to work together to isolate each individual even when they were within sight of their colleagues. By the third week of the expedition, the reported experiences shifted from passive environmental oddities to active sensory disturbances. Multiple members of the team began reporting the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing that seemed to originate from directly behind them. Whenever they turned to identify the source, there was nothing but the swaying branches of the hemlocks. This was not the quick, frantic breathing of a startled animal, but a slow, methodical respiration that matched the pace of a large lung capacity. One researcher recorded in his field notes that he stopped walking to tie his boot and heard the breathing stop exactly 2 seconds after he did. When he resumed his pace, the sound resumed. He tested this several times, finding that the auditory mimicry was nearly perfect but always slightly delayed, suggesting a conscious attempt to mirror his movements rather than a natural echo or an environmental fluke. The psychological strain on the crew became evident as the days progressed. They were not dealing with a threat they could see or a predator they could track. There were no tracks left in the soft moss, no broken branches, and no hair caught on the bark of the trees. The terrain remained undisturbed, yet the sensation of a physical presence was so overwhelming that several team members refused to leave the immediate perimeter of the base camp alone. They began to experience a shared perception of a tall, thin silhouette that would stand at the edge of their lantern light at night. This figure never moved or made a sound. It was described as being slightly darker than the surrounding night, a void in the shape of a human that lacked any discernible features. When they shone their high-powered flashlights toward the spot where they saw the shape, the beams would cut through the mist and reveal nothing but empty space between the trees. As the team moved deeper into the basin to complete their surveys, the time distortion began. This is a phenomenon often reported in high-strung survival situations, but the consistency among the different team members was what made this case stand out in local regional records. On one particular Tuesday, 2 surveyors left camp at 7 in the morning to mark a boundary line less than half a mile away. They estimated the task would take 2 hours at most. According to their watches and their internal sense of time, they performed the work and returned to camp in what felt like the expected duration. However, when they arrived back at the base, they found their colleagues in a state of panic. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon. The 2 men had been gone for 9 hours, but they had no memory of the missing 7 hours. They had not eaten their packed lunches, and they did not feel particularly hungry or tired, yet the sun was already beginning to set behind the western peaks. The lack of physical evidence was perhaps the most disturbing aspect for the researchers. They were trained to look at the world through a lens of data and tangible proof. They set up motion-activated cameras around the camp to catch whatever was stalking them. When they checked the film later, the cameras had been triggered dozens of times throughout the night. Every single frame was blank, showing only the empty forest floor or the trunks of the trees. There was no technical malfunction found with the equipment. It appeared as though something was triggering the sensors but remained invisible to the camera lens. This led to a theory among the crew that the phenomenon was not a biological entity at all, but some kind of localized electromagnetic or atmospheric anomaly that was playing tricks on their nervous systems and their electronic gear. One evening, the entire group experienced a collective auditory event that ended their desire to remain in the basin. They were sitting around a small stove, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, when a sound like a heavy metallic lid being slammed shut echoed through the valley. It was followed by a series of vocalizations that sounded like human speech played backward and at half speed. The sounds did not come from a single direction. They seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. The team described the feeling as a low-frequency hum that made their teeth ache and caused a deep sense of dread in their chests. It lasted for approximately 3 minutes before cutting off abruptly, leaving them in that same heavy, suffocating silence they had grown to fear. There was no wind that night, and there were no industrial operations or low-flying aircraft within 50 miles of their location. The following morning, the decision was made to break camp and head back to the trailhead early. The retreat was marked by a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. As they packed their gear, they found that several items had been moved. Their heavy sample bags, which had been neatly stacked the night before, were now scattered in a wide circle around the campsite. Nothing was missing and nothing was damaged, but the bags had been relocated with a precision that seemed intentional. The heaviest bags weighed over 60 pounds, and moving them would have required significant effort, yet no one had heard a sound during the night. The moss on the ground where the bags had been dragged showed no signs of disturbance, as if they had been lifted and placed down rather than pulled across the surface. During the hike out, the lead surveyor reported seeing a man standing in a thicket of ferns about 50 yards off the trail. The man was dressed in clothing that appeared to be from the 1920s, consisting of a heavy wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He was standing perfectly still, looking away from the trail. The surveyor called out to him, thinking it might be a lost hiker or a local resident, but the man did not respond. When the surveyor stepped off the trail to get a closer look, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows of the trees. It didn't run or hide, it simply ceased to be visible as the light shifted. The rest of the team, who were only a few paces behind, saw nothing but the ferns. This incident further cemented the idea that the environment itself was projecting images or memories that had no place in the present moment. When the group finally reached the trailhead and returned to their office in the city, they found it difficult to translate their experiences into an official report. How does a professional researcher explain that they were intimidated by a silence that felt like a physical weight, or that they lost 7 hours of their lives while walking a few hundred yards? The official documentation of the survey noted the geographic data and the soil samples they managed to collect, but the personal journals of the men involved told a much different story. They spoke of a place where the laws of physics and the boundaries of human perception seemed to blur. They spoke of a forest that felt less like a collection of trees and more like a single, massive consciousness that was aware of their presence and was slowly trying to incorporate them into its own distorted sense of time. In the years following the expedition, several members of the team returned to the Olympic Peninsula, but none of them would go back to that specific drainage basin. Local records from the area reveal a history of similar reports dating back to the late 19th century. Loggers in the 1890s wrote about the whistling trees that would sound like human voices calling out names in the dark. Native American oral traditions also warned of certain valleys in the interior that were avoided because they were considered places where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the unseen was dangerously thin. These stories were often dismissed as folklore or the results of cabin fever, but for the men who experienced the events in the 1990s, the fear was grounded in a very modern, very tangible reality. One of the most lingering effects of the encounter was the change in the team's perception of sound. Several members reported that for months after leaving the forest, they had difficulty sleeping in complete silence. They had grown so accustomed to the oppressive, artificial quiet of the basin that the normal sounds of a suburban neighborhood, the hum of a refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic felt abrasive and loud. Conversely, if they found themselves in a truly quiet room, they would start to hear that same rhythmic breathing they had heard in the woods. It was as if a part of their auditory processing had been permanently recalibrated by the environment they had stepped into. They were no longer able to trust their own ears, constantly questioning whether a sound was real or a lingering echo of the Olympic interior. The mystery of the missing time was never solved. No evidence of drug exposure, carbon monoxide poisoning, or shared delusional episodes could be found. The men were in peak physical and mental health prior to the trip. The equipment they used was calibrated and functioning correctly. The only common denominator was the location itself. Geologists have since looked into the area, noting that the specific mineral composition of the rock in that basin might create unusual magnetic variances, but nothing that would account for the level of sensory distortion reported by the witnesses. The magnetic theory also fails to explain the visual sightings or the organized movement of the heavy equipment. As the story of the survey team faded into local legend, it joined a long list of unexplained occurrences in the deep woods of the American Northwest. These are stories that don't involve monsters in the traditional sense, but rather a fundamental breakdown of what we consider to be reality. The forest remains there, a sprawling, indifferent expanse of green and gray. The drainage basin is still remote, rarely visited by anyone today. The trees continue to grow in the permanent twilight, and the silence remains as heavy as it was 30 years ago. For those who know where to look in the archives, the reports of the breathing woods and the missing hours serve as a quiet reminder that there are still pockets of the world where the human experience is not the dominant one. The psychological impact of the incident led one of the researchers to pursue a secondary career in acoustic ecology, trying to understand how soundscapes can influence human behavior and perception. He never found a perfect match for what he heard in the Olympics, but he did discover that certain low-frequency vibrations can induce feelings of paranoia and the sensation of being watched. However, he admitted that this scientific explanation didn't quite cover the visual elements or the synchronized loss of time. He remained convinced that while science could explain the symptoms, it couldn't explain the source. To him, the basin was a place where the environment was actively trying to communicate something, even if the human brain wasn't equipped to translate the message. The events are often cited in specialized circles as a classic example of an environmental haunting. Unlike a traditional haunting centered on a house or a grave, an environmental haunting is tied to the land itself. It is a recurring pattern of energy or perception that is triggered by specific conditions in the natural world. In this case, the combination of the dense canopy, the unique geography of the basin, and perhaps the specific weather patterns of the Olympic Peninsula created a perfect storm for a reality-bending experience. It suggests that our understanding of the wilderness is still very much on the surface, and that beneath the beauty of the national parks lies a layer of the world that is completely alien to us. The narrative of the Gray Forest serves as a cautionary tale for those who venture too far off the beaten path without respecting the power of the landscape. It isn't about the fear of a predator or the fear of getting lost. It is the fear of losing one's grip on the fundamental truths of existence. The men who walked into that basin were professionals who believed in maps, watches, and the reliability of their own senses. They walked out as men who understood that maps can be wrong, watches can skip hours, and senses can be manipulated by the very air they breathe. The unresolved tension of their story lies in that realization. The forest didn't attack them, it simply showed them that they didn't belong there, and that their presence was being tolerated by something much larger and much older than they could imagine. In the end, the records of the expedition were archived in a regional forestry library where they remain to this day. They are tucked between reports on soil acidity and timber yields, a strange and unsettling anomaly in a sea of dry data. Occasionally, a new researcher or a curious hiker will stumble upon the files and read about the breathing sounds and the missing hours. They might laugh it off as a joke or a product of the isolation, but if they ever find themselves in the deep interior of the Olympic Peninsula as the sun begins to set, they might find their thoughts returning to those old reports. They might find themselves listening a little more closely to the silence, and they might find themselves checking their watches a little more often, wondering if the time they are seeing is the same time the rest of the world is experiencing. The persistence of the gray blanket phenomenon suggests that these incidents are not isolated to a single decade or a single group of people. Rather, they are a part of the long-term history of the region. Every few years, a story emerges from the Olympics that mirrors the experiences of the 1990s team. A hiker reports hearing their own name called out by a voice that sounds exactly like their mother's. A camping group finds their tent moved 20 feet in the middle of the night without waking them. A photographer discovers a silhouette in the background of a shot that wasn't there when they pressed the shutter. These are the modern echoes of an ancient mystery, a set of experiences that defy classification and remain stubbornly outside the reach of conventional investigation. What makes this particular case so compelling is the lack of a definitive ending. There was no grand reveal, no confrontation, and no resolution. The team simply left, and the forest remained. This lack of closure is what keeps the story alive in the minds of those who study it. It forces us to confront the idea that some things in this world are not meant to be understood, they are simply meant to be witnessed. The Gray Forest is a place of witness, a location where the natural world performs a slow, silent drama that we can only catch glimpses of. It reminds us that for all our technology and our desire to map every inch of the planet, there are still places that remain dark, quiet, and fundamentally unknown. The surveyor who first noted the breathing sounds eventually retired to a small town on the coast, away from the heavy timber and the deep valleys. He spent his final years looking out at the ocean, an environment that he found much more honest than the forest. The ocean was dangerous, yes, but its dangers were visible and its sounds were consistent. It didn't mimic you, and it didn't steal your time. He rarely spoke about the 1990s expedition, but when he did, he always mentioned the same thing. He didn't care about what the thing in the woods was. He only cared that he had gotten out before the forest decided he was a part of it. His story, like the stories of the others, remains a testament to the unsettling power of the American wilderness and the thin line between reality and the unexplained. The geography of the Olympic Peninsula continues to shift as the years go by. New growth covers old trails, and landslides alter the shape of the valleys. The drainage basin where the events took place may look different today, but the core of the environment remains the same. It is a place of extreme moisture, extreme density, and extreme isolation. Those who study the area from a distance suggest that the specific combination of environmental factors there might never be fully replicated elsewhere, making it a unique laboratory for the strange. But for those who have been there, it is not a laboratory. It is a place where the air feels like a physical presence and where the silence has a heartbeat of its own. One detail that often gets overlooked in the archival reports is the state of the team's equipment months later. Several of the electronic devices that were used during the survey, handheld radios and GPS units, began to fail in strange ways. The radios would occasionally pick up low-frequency signals that sounded like heavy breathing even when they were turned off and the batteries were removed. The GPS units would sometimes display coordinates that didn't correspond to any location on Earth, showing the devices to be thousands of miles away or in the middle of the ocean. These technical glitches were dismissed as hardware degradation due to the moisture of the rainforest, but for the team members, it was a lingering reminder of the distorted reality they had inhabited. It was as if the equipment had been infected by the basin's logic, unable to function correctly in the normal world ever again. The legacy of the incident is found in the quiet conversations between park rangers and longtime residents of the peninsula. They know which areas to avoid during certain times of the year. They know that when the fog rolls in a certain way and the wind dies down completely, it's time to head back to the lowlands. They don't call it paranormal, and they don't call it a haunting. They just call it the way the woods are. This acceptance of the unexplained is a hallmark of the region, a recognition that the natural world has its own rules and its own moods. The story of the 1990s survey team is just one chapter in a much larger book of the Olympic interior, a book that is still being written by anyone brave or foolish enough to wander into the silence of the Gray Forest. As we look back on the timeline of these events, the escalation is clear. It began with a feeling, moved to a sound, transitioned into a distortion of time, and ended with a physical manipulation of the environment. This progression suggests a process of acclimatization, as if the environment was slowly tuning itself to the frequency of the human observers. If the team had stayed another week, it is impossible to know what the next stage would have been. Would the visual sightings have become more solid? Would the missing time have stretched into days or weeks? The decision to leave was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of self-preservation. They left because they realized they were losing the ability to distinguish between what was happening around them and what was happening within them. The final report from the lead researcher concluded with a surprisingly candid remark for a government document. He wrote that while the mission was a success in terms of data collection, he recommended that the specific sector be designated as a restricted area for future research. He didn't provide a scientific justification for this, but simply stated that the psychological toll on personnel was too high to justify further exploration. The recommendation was never officially adopted, but the sector remains largely ignored by the Forestry Service to this day. It is a place that has been effectively erased from the map by a consensus of silence. The mystery of the Gray Forest stands as a prominent example of how the real world can sometimes produce experiences that are more frightening than any fictional story. There are no jump scares here, no gore, and no clear villain. There is only the slow realization that the world we think we know is actually a very thin veneer over something much more complex and much more indifferent to our existence. The men of the survey team were not victims of a crime, but they were victims of a profound loss of certainty. They learned that the forest is not just a place we visit, it is a place that can visit us, changing our perception of time, sound, and reality itself. And once that change has happened, there is no going back to the way things were before. Today, the Olympic Peninsula remains a destination for millions of tourists who come to see its rugged beauty. They hike the trails, take photos of the moss-covered trees, and marvel at the scale of the landscape. Most of them never experience anything out of the ordinary. They stay on the path, they keep an eye on the time, and they return to their cars before dark. But for a few, the forest reveals its other side. They might notice the silence getting a bit too heavy, or they might hear a sound that doesn't belong. For them, the story of the 1990s survey team isn't just a piece of local history, it is a warning. It is a reminder that in the heart of the woods, there is a gray forest that is always watching, always breathing, and always waiting for someone to lose their way in its silent, timeless embrace. The details of the breathing and the silhouettes have been mirrored in other accounts across the border in Canada and further south in the Oregon wilderness, suggesting a broader phenomenon that spans the entire Pacific Northwest. Some researchers have suggested a link to infrasound produced by the interaction of wind and specific geological formations, which can cause hallucinations and physical discomfort. Others point to the possibility of unknown chemical compounds released by certain types of fungi in the deep woods. While these theories provide a comforting layer of scientific possibility, they fail to account for the shared nature of the experiences. When 5 different people see the same shadow and hear the same sound at the same time, the explanation must account for more than just an individual's brain chemistry. In the end, the story is left to the archives and the memories of the few who were there. It remains a definitive case of a real-world paranormal encounter that was documented by credible witnesses and never solved. It challenges our understanding of the environment and our place within it. The Olympic Peninsula is a vast and beautiful place, but it is also a place of deep shadows and unexplained silences. The next time you find yourself in the deep woods and the wind dies down and the birds stop singing, take a moment to listen. You might just hear the rhythmic breathing of the forest itself, reminding you that you are just a guest in a world that doesn't always play by your rules. The survey team members eventually moved on with their lives, but they were forever marked by those 3 weeks in the basin. One became a recluse, Another changed careers entirely to work in urban planning, and the rest simply stopped going into the woods for recreation. The bond they formed was one of shared trauma and mutual understanding, a silent agreement never to fully explain what they felt during those missing hours. They knew that words would only diminish the reality of the experience. They had touched something that wasn't meant to be touched, and they had seen a side of the world that most people are lucky enough to never encounter. Their legacy is a reminder that the greatest horrors are often those that cannot be seen, but only felt in the weight of the air and the stillness of the trees. The story of the Gray Forest is not a ghost story in the traditional sense, but it is a story about the haunting power of the natural world. It is about the way a landscape can hold on to memories, or the way it can project a reality that is completely separate from our own. It is about the fragility of the human mind when faced with something it cannot categorize. As long as there are remote places on this earth, there will be stories like this. Stories of people who went into the wild and came back, changed not by what they saw, but by what they couldn't see. The Olympic interior remains a testament to that enduring mystery, a place where the gray blanket still falls and where the silence is never truly empty. What happened inside this roadside motel room will shock you. The motel sat along a fading highway outside Flagstaff, Arizona, a place drivers passed without remembering. In late autumn, one occupied room became the focus of an investigation that never fully closed. What happened inside room 11 was reconstructed later through records, interviews, and conflicting testimony. No official report ever described a clear sequence of events. Daniel Mercer was 34 years old, a freelance wildlife photographer traveling between seasonal contracts. He checked into the roadside motel, reportedly seeking rest, before heading north to document winter migration patterns. Dispatch logs show his phone last connected to a local cell tower shortly after sunset. The front desk clerk recalled nothing unusual about him, only that he asked for a quiet room. State records confirm he paid cash for 2 nights. The second person tied to the case was Lila Henson, age 29, a substitute teacher from Prescott. County file notes state she was driving alone toward Utah to visit her sister after a school term ended. She later told investigators she stopped because her car overheated near the motel. Some locals claimed they saw her speaking with Mercer near the vending machines that evening. Investigators never confirmed whether the two knew each other before that night. A third individual appears only indirectly in archived notes, a man identified as Thomas Reed, age 48, employed as a night maintenance worker. His stated purpose at the location was routine repair and security checks. Reed reportedly told deputies he heard loud voices from room 11 around 11:30 p.m. Dispatch logs list no complaint calls from other guests during that window. Records conflict on whether Reed entered the room that night. According to motel key data, room 11 was accessed twice after midnight. The system was outdated, and investigators noted possible logging errors in state records. Lila Henson claimed she returned to her car before midnight and slept inside it. Surveillance footage from the parking lot was overwritten within 72 hours. Some locals claimed the motel cameras never worked to begin with. Inside room 11, investigators later documented overturned furniture and a shattered bedside lamp. There were no clear signs of forced entry according to the county file. Archived notes mention a strong metallic odor, though no source was identified. Blood traces were reportedly found, but not enough to determine injury severity. Investigators never confirmed whether the scene suggested a struggle or panic. Daniel Mercer was reported missing 2 days later when he failed to appear at a scheduled ranger checkpoint north of the city. Park Service records show his vehicle was still parked at the motel. His camera equipment remained inside the room, undisturbed according to initial inventory. State records indicate his wallet and phone were missing. No official explanation addressed why he would leave essential gear behind. Lila Henson was questioned once and released without charges. She reportedly told investigators that Daniel appeared nervous and distracted when they spoke briefly. She denied entering his room and said she left the property early morning. Dispatch logs confirm her car was seen on a highway camera at dawn. Investigators never confirmed whether she was alone in the vehicle. Maintenance worker Thomas Reed resigned 3 weeks after the incident. Archived notes mention inconsistencies between his written statement and later interview. He reportedly claimed he smelled ozone near room 11, a detail not supported by forensic analysis. Some locals claimed Reed avoided discussing the case afterward. State records show no further follow-up interviews were conducted. Search efforts focused on nearby Forest Service land and abandoned mining roads. Rangers found no trace of Mercer despite favorable weather conditions. County file notes mention reports of unusual radio interference during the search. Investigators never confirmed any connection between those reports and the disappearance. The case remained classified as a missing person with undetermined circumstances. In the weeks following the disappearance, investigators revisited the motel several times. County file entries describe minor structural damage behind the drywall near room 11. No explanation was given for how it occurred or when. The motel owner reportedly repaired it without documentation. Records conflict on whether samples were collected before repairs. Archive notes show that Daniel Mercer had photographed unusual animal tracks days earlier near a restricted forest area. The images were stored on a memory card recovered from his camera. Some prints appeared distorted, inconsistent with known species, according to one ranger. Investigators never confirmed whether the photos were relevant to the motel incident. State records list the images as inconclusive. A separate lead emerged involving a payphone once located across the highway. Dispatch logs recorded a brief call placed at 12:42 a.m. from that phone. The call lasted less than 30 seconds and did not connect. Some locals claimed the phone produced static even when working. Investigators never confirmed who attempted the call. The payphone was removed the following year. Lila Henson contacted authorities again 3 months later. She reportedly said she remembered hearing knocking while inside her car that night. Her statement conflicted with her earlier claim of uninterrupted sleep. County file notes show investigators questioned the change but took no action. Records conflict on whether her revised account was formally recorded. Some locals claimed stress influenced her memory. During a routine audit, state records revealed an unlogged maintenance entry for room 11. The timestamp fell between 1:15 and 1:40 a.m. Thomas Reed denied making the entry when contacted by phone. Archive notes state he ended the call abruptly. Investigators never confirmed if the system error was human or technical. The audit report offered no conclusion. Park rangers later reported finding Mercer's jacket near a seasonal creek bed. The location was 12 miles from the motel and difficult to access on foot. The jacket showed no signs of tearing or blood. Dispatch logs indicate the item was logged but not photographed. Records conflict on whether the jacket was verified by family. Investigators never confirmed how it reached the area. Some locals claimed unusual lights were seen near the tree line that same week. These reports were included in archive notes but marked as unverified. Investigators attributed them to distant vehicles or equipment. No formal interviews were conducted regarding the sightings. State records show no attempt to correlate times or locations. The claims remained anecdotal. A private investigator hired by Mercer's family reviewed county files 2 years later. His report noted missing timestamps and altered page numbers. He reportedly suggested evidence handling errors rather than misconduct. Investigators never responded publicly to his findings. State records acknowledge receipt of the report without comment. The family declined further interviews. Room 11 was eventually renumbered during a motel renovation. No plaque or marker references the incident. New management stated they were unaware of the case details. Archive notes confirm original records were boxed and stored off-site. Some locals claimed guests still request Room 11 out of curiosity. Investigators never monitored those requests. As of 2024, Daniel Mercer remains missing. His case file is still open but inactive, according to state records. No charges were filed and no official cause was determined. Dispatch logs end without resolution. What occurred inside that roadside motel room remains undocumented. Investigators never confirmed whether anyone else knows more than what was recorded. In later years, former motel guests came forward with fragmented memories. One truck driver reportedly recalled hearing a sharp impact against a wall that night. He said it sounded heavier than a door slam. His statement was never added to the official county file. Records conflict on whether investigators considered him a credible witness. Archived weather data shows temperatures dropped rapidly after midnight. Investigators noted exposure risk if Mercer had left the motel on foot. No footprints were documented around the building despite soft ground conditions. State records list this as an oversight rather than evidence. Some locals claimed wind erased any traces before sunrise. Investigators never confirmed the timeline. A forensic review of the room occurred 6 months later. By then, furnishings had been replaced and walls repainted. Archive notes indicate trace testing was no longer possible. Investigators acknowledged the delay, limited conclusions. County file entries suggest budget constraints influenced the timing. No supplemental report followed the review. Dispatch logs show one unanswered radio transmission from a ranger unit during the initial search. The transmission contained only static and cut off abruptly. Investigators attributed it to terrain interference. Some locals claimed similar interference occurred near abandoned mine shafts. State records do not show further investigation into that claim. The matter was closed administratively. Daniel Mercer's family continued informal searches for several summers. They reportedly focused on water sources and game trails he might follow instinctively. No personal items were recovered during these efforts. County file notes mention family frustration with limited cooperation. Investigators never confirmed whether all search data was shared. Records conflict on agency coordination. Lila Henson eventually relocated out of state. A brief follow-up interview was conducted by phone. She reportedly said she avoided thinking about the motel entirely. Her tone was described as controlled but hesitant in archived notes. Investigators never classified her as a suspect. No further contact was recorded. Thomas Reed was later linked to unrelated employment disputes. None involved criminal allegations, according to state records. Archived notes mention difficulty locating him for additional questioning. Investigators never issued a subpoena. Some locals claimed he changed his name. That claim was never verified. Inconsistent evidence handling became a recurring theme in internal reviews. County file summaries reference misfiled photographs and duplicated forms. Investigators acknowledged procedural weaknesses. No disciplinary actions were documented. State records show the department updated protocols the following year. The Mercer case was cited internally without detail. A final lead surfaced when hikers reported hearing voices near the creek at dusk. Rangers searched the area and found nothing. Archived notes classify the report as environmental audio distortion. Investigators never confirmed the source. Some locals continued to avoid the area afterward. No official advisory was issued. The motel still operates under a different name. Room 11 no longer exists on the floor plan. County file closure notes state there is insufficient evidence to determine events. Dispatch logs offer no final entry. What happened that night remains unresolved within official records. Investigators never confirmed whether the full account was ever known. Years after the incident, a retired deputy reviewed old dispatch logs for training purposes. He reportedly noticed time gaps that did not align with standard logging intervals. The gaps were not flagged during the original review. State records indicate the deputy raised the issue informally. No amended report was created. Archived motel invoices show an unscheduled power reset during the early morning hours. The reset affected only one wing of the building. Investigators initially attributed it to aging infrastructure. Records conflict on whether Room 11 was included in that circuit. The motel electrician could not be located for follow-up. The matter was noted without resolution. A former park ranger later stated Mercer had asked about restricted zones days earlier. The ranger recalled the questions as unusual but not alarming. Archive notes include this recollection without corroboration. Investigators never confirmed the conversation through written records. State files list the ranger's statement as supplemental. No further inquiry followed. County file entries reference a handwritten note found in Mercer's car. The note listed coordinates without explanation. Investigators attempted to locate the area with no results. Records conflict on whether the coordinates were accurate or incomplete. The note was returned to the family. No copy remains in evidence. Several months later, a utility worker reported finding a damaged flashlight near a service road. The item matched the model Mercer owned. Dispatch logs show the report was acknowledged. Investigators never recovered the flashlight. Archive notes suggest it may have been discarded before retrieval. State records do not clarify the outcome. Public interest briefly increased after a regional news segment aired. The segment cited missing person statistics and rural motel risks. Some locals claimed the coverage overstated known facts. Investigators issued a brief statement reaffirming uncertainty. County files include a transcript of the broadcast. No new tips were logged afterward. An academic researcher later requested access to anonymized case data. The request was partially granted. Archive notes show several pages were withheld. Investigators cited privacy concerns. Records conflict on what criteria were applied. The researcher published no findings related to the case. During a wildfire evacuation years later, the surrounding area was searched incidentally. Crews found no remains or personal effects. Dispatch logs mentioned terrain disruption from previous fires. Investigators noted that any earlier evidence may have been destroyed. State records classify this as an environmental limitation. The search yielded no updates. Mercer's disappearance continues to appear in internal training materials. It is referenced as an example of incomplete data. County file summaries emphasize procedural caution. Investigators never attributed fault to any individual. Records conflict on whether earlier intervention could have changed outcomes. The case remains instructive rather than resolved. No additional witnesses have come forward in recent years. The motel incident is rarely discussed publicly. Archived notes end with a recommendation for periodic review. Dispatch logs remain unchanged. What occurred inside that roadside motel room remains unsupported by definitive evidence. Investigators never confirmed whether the truth was lost or simply unrecorded. The Siege of the MacDonald Homestead. The landscape surrounding the Chenalacart in the early 19th century was a place defined by water and stillness. Located in what is now Western Ontario, the region was a dense tapestry of marshlands, slow-moving tributaries, and heavy, brooding forests that crowded the edges of the settlement. The air hung thick with moisture, blurring the horizon and dampening sound. It was a place where the separation between land and river often felt indistinct, a geography of mud and reeds that demanded constant vigilance from those who attempted to farm it. The silence of the area was not empty but heavy, filled with the drone of insects and the shifting of water against the banks. In 1829, this isolated stretch of land became the setting for a series of events that would eventually be recorded in the annals of Canadian folklore as one of the most violent and prolonged physical hauntings on record. The focus of the disturbance was the homestead of John MacDonald, a quiet and industrious man who had settled in the Baldoon settlement near Wallaceburg. The house itself was a sturdy structure, built from the timber cleared from the property, designed to withstand the harsh winters and the humid summers of the lowlands. It was a functional, unpretentious dwelling that housed MacDonald and his family, offering shelter against the raw elements of the frontier. The disturbances began in the summer, a season usually dedicated to the hard labor of maintaining crops and livestock. The initial anomalies were easily dismissed, attributed to the natural settling of the house or the mischief of local wildlife. Members of the family reported hearing odd sounds within the walls, dull thuds that did not correspond to any known cause. At first, these noises were infrequent, occurring only at night when the house was still. They were described as the sound of something heavy dropping onto the floorboards in the empty attic, or the scratching of a large animal against the exterior logs. However, inspections of the property revealed nothing. There were no rats, no raccoons, and no loose timber that could account for the persistent, rhythmic nature of the sounds. As the weeks progressed into late June, the activity escalated from auditory to physical. The first incident to cause genuine alarm occurred on a clear afternoon when the women of the household were working in the barn. Without warning, a heavy wooden pole, part of the roof structure, dislodged itself and fell to the ground. This was followed by another and then another. The women retreated, confused by the sudden structural failure of a building that had been sound only moments before. When John MacDonald investigated, he found the beams lying on the dirt floor, but he could find no evidence of rot or breakage that would explain why they had fallen. He repaired the roof, securing the poles with fresh lashings, only to find them scattered on the ground again the following morning. The phenomenon soon moved from the outbuildings into the main house, marking a shift in intensity. The sound of footsteps became a common occurrence, heavy boots pacing the length of the loft when no one was upstairs. The family would gather in the main room, listening as the invisible walker moved back and forth above their heads. The pacing was deliberate, possessing a cadence that suggested a distinct intelligence rather than a random settling of wood. It would stop when someone climbed the ladder to investigate, only to resume the moment they returned to the ground floor. The atmosphere in the house began to change, the air growing heavy and oppressive, creating a sense of being watched that unnerved even the most skeptical visitors. It was not long before the auditory phenomena gave way to projectiles. The family was sitting at dinner one evening when a small stone dropped from the ceiling, landing on the table with a sharp clatter. It was a smooth, river-worn stone, wet as if it had just been pulled from the water. Before the family could react, another stone fell, then another. They checked the ceiling, the loft, and the windows, but found no gaps large enough to admit the stones, nor anyone outside who could have thrown them. The stones seemed to materialize out of the air itself, dropping straight down rather than flying in a trajectory that would suggest an external thrower. This phase of the haunting continued for weeks. Stones of varying sizes would crash through the windows, shattering the glass. John MacDonald, desperate to protect his home, nailed boards over the window frames, plunging the interior into permanent twilight. Yet, the stones continued to find their way inside. They would drop down the chimney, bounce off the walls, and roll across the floor. Neighbors who came to witness the events reported seeing stones rising from the riverbank and hurtling toward the house, as if propelled by a strong arm, yet the area surrounding the house was empty. Men were stationed around the perimeter of the property with muskets, watching for pranksters, but they saw no one. They stood guard for nights on end, watching the house endure a bombardment from an invisible siege force. The situation deteriorated further when the projectiles changed from stones to lead bullets. These were not fired from a gun, but appeared to be dropped or thrown with significant force. They would smash through the remaining glass or strike the walls with a sound like a hammer blow. Curiously, when the bullets struck a person, they often did so with less force than expected, dropping harmlessly to the ground after making contact. Witnesses described picking up the bullets and finding them warm to the touch. The local authorities were baffled. There was no report of gunfire, no smoke, and no flash, only the physical impact of the lead balls arriving from nowhere. By the autumn of 1829, the MacDonald family was living in a state of constant siege. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep was impossible, as the house was subjected to a nightly barrage of noise and debris. The community of Baldoon, initially skeptical, became deeply involved. People traveled from neighboring settlements to witness the phenomenon. They saw the broken windows, the bruised family members, and the piles of stones and lead that had accumulated in the corners of the rooms. The local clergy were called in to offer prayers, but the activities seemed to mock their efforts, often intensifying during religious observances. The haunting then took a more dangerous turn with the arrival of fire. Small, spontaneous fires began to break out within the house. A towel hanging on a rack would suddenly burst into flames. A pile of bedding would begin to smolder and smoke. These fires occurred in plain sight, often when multiple witnesses were present. On one occasion, a visitor watched as a small flame ignited on the cuff of his own coat. The family was forced to institute a constant fire watch, keeping buckets of water in every room. They lived in fear that the house would be consumed while they slept. The fires were not limited to the house. The outbuildings, which had been the site of the initial disturbances, became targets. The barn, filled with the season's hay, was a constant source of anxiety. Despite the family's vigilance, fires would start in the center of the haymows, in areas that were inaccessible and damp. John MacDonald and his neighbors spent hours extinguishing these blazes, only to have them reignite elsewhere. The smell of smoke became a permanent part of the atmosphere at the homestead, clinging to the clothes and hair of everyone who lived there. As winter approached, the activity shifted again, targeting the livestock. The animals on the farm became skittish and unmanageable. Horses would be found trembling in their stalls, their coats soaked with sweat as if they had been ridden hard all night. Cows would break free from their enclosures, found miles away in the dense woods. The family reported hearing the sounds of a phantom hunt, the baying of hounds, and the shouting of men echoing from the forest, though no hunters were ever seen. The oxen were found with their tails braided and knotted in intricate patterns that would have taken hours for a human to accomplish. The most disturbing aspect of the livestock phenomena involved the death of the animals. Chickens were found dead with their necks broken, a prize ox dropped dead in the field without any sign of illness or injury. The economic impact on the MacDonald family was devastating. They were losing their home, their peace of mind, and now their livelihood. The community rallied around them, offering labor and supplies, but the fear was contagious. People began to avoid the road that passed by the MacDonald property after dark, afraid of being struck by a stray stone or seeing something they could not explain. Reports from the time indicate that John MacDonald was a man pushed to the brink of ruin. He sought help from every available source. He consulted with doctors, magistrates, and indigenous elders from the nearby communities. A school teacher named Robert Barker, who fancied himself a researcher of natural phenomena, spent time at the house documenting the events. Barker recorded the trajectory of the stones and the frequency of the fires, attempting to find a scientific explanation. He noted that the stones often followed curved paths that defied the laws of physics, turning corners to enter rooms or navigating around obstacles before striking their target. One particular incident recorded by witnesses involved a cradle where the infant of the family slept. The heavy wooden cradle began to rock violently on its own, faster and faster, until it seemed it would tip over. When the mother rushed to steady it, she was thrown back by an unseen force. The baby remained asleep, undisturbed by the motion. This event was witnessed by several neighbors who had come to offer support. They described the air around the cradle as being cold, a localized drop in temperature that chilled the skin. The haunting continued into 1830, spanning nearly 2 years of relentless activity. The family was exhausted. They had moved furniture out of the house to save it from fire, living in a bare shell of a home. The windows remained boarded, the chimney blocked to prevent stones from entering. They cooked outside when the weather permitted, afraid to light the hearth indoors. The isolation of the MacDonald family deepened as the phenomenon persisted. While the community was sympathetic, there was also a growing sense of unease, a fear that whatever was afflicting the MacDonalds might spread to other households. In an effort to end the torment, John MacDonald traveled to consult with a woman known for her knowledge of the supernatural, the daughter of a man who had been involved in similar cases in the past. She lived a considerable distance away, and the journey took him several days. According to the accounts, she told him that the source of the trouble was a localized curse, potentially driven by a neighbor who coveted his land. She advised him to make a silver bullet and shoot a black goose that had been seen among his flock. The presence of this bird had been noted by the family. It was a stray that did not belong to their gaggle and seemed always to be present when the disturbances were at their peak. This element of the story, while steeped in the folklore of the era, is a matter of record in the testimonies of the time. MacDonald returned to Baldoon and fashioned a bullet from a piece of silver. He waited for the appearance of the black goose. When he spotted it near the river, he fired. The bird was struck and wounded, fleeing into the tall reeds of the marsh. MacDonald attempted to pursue it, but the terrain was too difficult, and the bird vanished into the thick vegetation. He returned to the house, unsure if his action had any effect. The following day, reports circulated in the community about an elderly woman who lived in a nearby cabin. She was a solitary figure, often at odds with her neighbors, including the MacDonalds. It was said that she had been discovered in her home suffering from a sudden and unexplained injury to her arm, a wound that corresponded to the location where the goose had been shot. The woman refused medical attention and remained secluded in her cabin. While no legal connection was ever made and no crime was ever charged, the timing of her injury coincided precisely with the shooting of the bird. Whether coincidental or causal, the activity at the MacDonald homestead ceased almost immediately after this event. The stones stopped falling, the fires no longer ignited, the sounds of pacing in the loft faded into silence. The sudden cessation of the phenomena was as jarring as its onset. The family, who had lived in a state of high adrenaline alert for 2 years, found themselves in a quiet house. The relief was palpable, but so was the lingering trauma. They had survived a prolonged assault by forces they could not understand or name. The aftermath of the Baldoon haunting left deep scars on the landscape and the people. The MacDonald house, battered and scorched, stood as a testament to the ordeal. The family worked to repair the damage, replacing the roof and the windows, scrubbing the soot from the walls. But the story of what happened there became a permanent part of the local history. The location was regarded with superstition for generations. People would point out the site as they passed, recounting the stories of the stones that flew like birds and the fires that started from nothing. Historians and researchers who have examined the Baldoon case have noted the sheer volume of witnesses. This was not a story told by a single frightened individual in the dark. It was a public event, witnessed by dozens of people in broad daylight. The stones were held in the hands of skeptics, the fires were extinguished by the bucket brigades of the community, the bullet holes in the walls remained visible for years, physical proof of the violence that had occurred. The sheer duration of the event, lasting nearly 2 years, sets it apart from fleeting paranormal encounters. It was a sustained occupation of a domestic space. The nature of the phenomena at Baldoon shares characteristics with what is now classified as poltergeist activity, the movement of objects, the targeted fires, the noises. However, the intensity and the aggressive nature of the projectiles were unusual. The stones did not just fall, they were thrown with intent. The bullets suggested a mimicry of human violence, a ghostly reflection of the weaponry of the time. The events seemed designed to drive the family out, to make the land uninhabitable. It was a territorial dispute between the living and the unseen. In the years that followed, the MacDonald family continued to farm the land, though the memory of the siege never fully faded. The children who had grown up amidst the crashing stones and sudden fires carried the stories with them into adulthood. The narrative was preserved in family letters and local newspaper articles, which treated the events not as a ghost story, but as a matter of public record, a series of unexplained calamities that had befallen a respected neighbor. The tone of these early reports was one of bewilderment rather than sensationalism. The environment of the Chenille Ecarte likely played a role in the atmosphere of the haunting. The isolation, the swamp gases, and the unique acoustics of the river valley created a setting where reality could feel malleable. Some theories suggested that the phenomena were the result of natural gas leaks or seismic activity, but these explanations failed to account for the intelligence behind the disturbances, the way the stones targeted specific windows, or the way the fires avoided consuming the entire house, starting only in small, controllable bursts until the family was worn down. The legacy of the Baldoon mystery is one of unresolved tension. There was no definitive explanation ever provided. The connection to the elderly neighbor and the silver bullet remains in the realm of folklore, a narrative device used to make sense of the chaos. The reality of what happened inside the MacDonald house was likely far more complex and terrifying than the legend suggests. It was a breakdown of the natural order, a period of time where the laws of physics seemed to be suspended within the boundaries of a single property. Today, the site of the haunting is quiet. The original buildings are long gone, reclaimed by the earth and the passage of time. The landscape has changed, drained, and cultivated, the wild marshes tamed. But the accounts remain preserved in the archives of Ontario history. They tell of a time when a family was besieged by an invisible enemy, when the sanctity of the home was violated by forces that defied explanation. The stones of Baldoon may have stopped falling, but the echo of their impact resonates in the silence of the historical record. The specific details of the fires remain particularly baffling to modern researchers. The descriptions of cold fire flames that consumed fabric but did not immediately burn the skin appear in several witness accounts. This detail, often overlooked in summaries, suggests a phenomenon that was not purely thermal combustion. It aligns with other historical poltergeist cases where thermodynamic anomalies were reported. The fires were almost theatrical in their presentation, appearing in the center of a room or on a person's clothing, demanding immediate attention and creating a chaotic spectacle. The behavior of the bullets is equally strange. The fact that they were described as warm but traveled with low velocity upon impact suggests they were not fired from a charge of gunpowder. A bullet fired from a musket would be hot from friction and the explosion, and it would embed itself deeply in wood or flesh. These bullets dropped or were lobbed, yet they possessed enough mass to break glass. It was as if they were being teleported or manifested rather than shot. The collection of lead balls that the family accumulated became a tangible curiosity, a pile of ammunition for a war that had no soldiers. Witnesses also noted the psychological state of the family. They were described not as hysterical, but as grimly determined. John MacDonald was a pragmatist, a man who built his life with his hands. To be confronted with a problem he could not fix with a hammer or a gun was deeply destabilizing. The accounts describe him sitting in his chair, watching the stones fall, his face set in a mask of resignation. He was a man under siege, holding his ground against an enemy he could not see. The role of the community in the Baldoon mystery is significant. In many haunting cases, the victims are isolated and disbelieved. In Baldoon, the community was present, they brought food, they stood guard, they witnessed the events firsthand. This collective witnessing lends the case a weight that is often lacking in other reports. It was not a private delusion, it was a communal crisis. The fear that the infection would spread was a very real concern for the neighbors. They worried that whatever door had been opened at the McDonald farm might not be easily closed. As the narrative of the Baldoon mystery was retold over the decades, it acquired layers of interpretation. The romanticized version focuses on the silver bullet and the witch, a satisfying conclusion where good triumphs over evil. But the raw data of the case, the 2 years of grinding daily torment, tells a different story. It tells of a survival situation, of a family living in a combat zone within their own walls. It speaks to the fragility of safety and the terrifying realization that the walls we build to keep the world out are permeable to forces we do not understand. The final days of the haunting were marked by an escalation that seemed unsustainable. The fires were becoming more frequent, the damage more severe. It felt as though the phenomenon was building toward a catastrophic conclusion. The sudden stop was the only mercy the family received. When the noise finally ceased, the silence that followed must have been deafening. They waited for the next stone, the next crash, but it never came. The siege was over, leaving them to pick up the pieces of their shattered domesticity. Even now, the story of the Baldoon mystery serves as a reminder of the unknowns that permeate the history of the frontier. It is a narrative of endurance, of a family that refused to be driven from their land despite the overwhelming pressure to leave. It remains one of Canada's most compelling historical mysteries, a sequence of events that resists easy categorization and refuses to be fully explained. The image of the stones rising from the river, dripping wet and cold to strike the house of John MacDonald, is an enduring portrait of the uncanny, a moment where the natural world turned against the people who sought to tame it. The archival records from the era, including the diaries of traveling ministers and the letters of local officials, corroborate the timeline of events. They speak of a great disturbance in the Baldoon settlement, of a visitation that troubled the peace of the entire district. These documents do not offer solutions, they merely record the facts of the disruption. They serve as a sterile, bureaucratic confirmation of the chaos that engulfed the MacDonald homestead. They stand as a sober counterpoint to the more fantastic elements of the oral tradition. In the end, the MacDonald family's experience at Baldoon stands as a singular event in the history of the paranormal. It was not a fleeting glimpse of a ghost or a momentary chill. It was a physical assault, a tangible, destructive force that operated with impunity for months on end. It challenged the rationality of everyone who witnessed it, forcing hard-headed pioneers to confront the possibility that their world was not as solid or predictable as they believed. The mystery of what truly happened in that house near the Chenala cart remains locked in the past, hidden in the silence of the vanished wetlands.